Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Chapter 3.
What has been said of the increase of taxes, their tendency to ruin a nation and bring on its decline, together with the counteraction occasioned by the continuance of necessity as being applicable to all nations in general, applies in every sense to England, and even more to England than to any other nation. Taxes are carried to greater excess than in any other country, and as England flourishes by trade and manufactures, the price of which taxes enhance, they gradually tend to shut foreign markets against us. This has already been explained. We, however, still have to inquire into the particular manner in which it operates upon this country. That the system of taxation, though irregular in England, is less so than in any other country, in proportion to the extent to which it has been carried, is true. But still, however, if a number of the most troublesome and ill-contrived taxes were done away, and others established in their place, it would be a great advantage. Greater danger arises from the augmentation of taxes in a wealthy country than in a poor one, when they stretch beyond the proper line, because the general prosperity hinders the effect from being visible, till it has advanced beyond the power of remedy, whereas in a poor country the injury is soon felt. The invention and industry of this country have been most wonderfully increased by the necessity of exertion, under the protection of good laws, which rendered property secure. But we trust too much to our resources, and like men in health and vigor, are the most likely to injure our constitution. The most part of the arts, in point of manufacturing, seem to have come to nearly the last degree of perfection, so far as abbreviation of labor can carry them. The division of labor and the modes of working in the iron and metal branches have not of late been in any material degree improved in our towns, the most famous for them. And as to any particular gift of bringing things to perfection, or reducing prices, it does not appear to be confined to England. Watches and firearms are two of the most ingenious and nice branches of metal manufactures. Yet, at Liege, the latter is carried to greater perfection than at Birmingham, and London and Lancashire are outdone by Switzerland in the former. Those, indeed, are not manufactures of which the taste or form is constantly altering, but they are a proof of the ability to work with equal advantage, both as to quality and price, with the manufacturers of this country. The next great branches are the weaving. For silks, France has always had the advantage of us, and our fine woolen cloths have never equaled those of Louviers and Satin for quality, although, in point of price, they have the advantage. In linens, we enjoy no particular preeminence, and in the American market, we are beginning to be undersold by those of Silesia. For a second quality of woolen cloth, and for the manufacture of cotton in all its branches, we still have the superiority, but our great advantage, the cause of the general preference to our manufactures, is the long credit we give, which, if it should ever cease to be practicable, would ruin not one, but all our manufactures, nearly at a stroke. It is very natural and very well for Englishmen, who have never been out of their own country, to ascribe to superiority of quality, and inferiority of price is the same thing, the great success they have in selling their goods in foreign countries. But such as have had an opportunity to see how it really is, know the contrary, and those who have not, may know it by observing who are the individuals in any branch of business at home that do the most, and they will find it always to be those who have the power of giving the longest credit. It is true that, in the course of time, and by struggling hard, those who have little means of extending their business at first do it by degrees. But until they do, they never can, in point of quantity, rival those who give long credit. In the inability of other nations to give equal length of credit consists our principal advantage. But we have seen by the vicissitudes of ancient nations that the wants of others, or their being behindhand, are but a very insecure tenure for the prosperity of any nation. The exportation of Britain was but inconsiderable at the beginning of last century, or about 1/9 of what it was 2 years ago. Previous to the American War, it gradually increased to about 3 times what it was in the year 1700, that is, in 75 years. The progression was pretty regular till the year 1750, when it had risen to nearly double, but in 25 years after, it increased as much as it had in 50 years before. The American War threw it back 40 years, but it soon got up again to where it probably would have been had the American War not intervened. It, however, rose beyond anything that had ever been seen. It doubled in less than 10 years, and from this we are led to conclude that the taxes had not then begun to hurt national industry. But we shall see the reason, for the great increase was not owing so much to any cause inherent in this nation as to the absolute impossibility of other nations continuing their commerce. We had got all the East and West India trade of the French and Dutch, and America had again become our greatest customer for British manufactures. Capital that could be removed was, in a manner, banished from the continent of Europe, and had taken refuge in England, and a great extent of the continent had been desolated with war. We are not, however, to expect this amazing export trade to continue. Indeed, it has already fallen in 1 year as much as it ever rose in any 3 years. It fell 15 millions in 1 year. The taxes may have operated much against our prosperity without our knowing it in a crisis of this sort, though they did not absolutely counteract the favorable effect produced by other causes. The commerce of the American states, which were, like England, out of the vortex of danger and secure, increased in fully as rapid a manner as ours, and fell off in the same way. We must not, then, consider as durable or owing to ourselves circumstances that arose out of the general and temporary situation of other nations. It has been said in the general chapter on taxation, and again repeated in that on national debt, that both the one and the other operate for a certain time in augmenting the industry and wealth of a country, but that there is some point at which they begin to have a contrary effect. That point, however, being dependent on a variety of circumstances, is not a fixed one. It cannot be discovered by investigation before the time, but it may by symptoms and signs that become visible soon after. It is a sign that a nation has passed the point at which taxes cease to be a spur to industry, when the duties on consumption or optional duties, which one may avoid paying, by not using the article taxed, become less productive than formerly, and when it is found necessary to lay taxes on land, houses, and such sort of property as can be made to pay, independent of the will of the proprietor. When taxes are laid upon property, not on consumption, it is to be supposed the latter can bear no more. Taxes on property are forced taxes. On consumption, they are generally, to a certain degree, voluntary, though not always so. The augmentation of wealth has in this country been great, but it has never been regular or uninterrupted. That of taxation has, on the contrary, been uninterrupted, and this is better seen from the chart than from anything that can be said. There can be no doubt that, though hitherto our increasing prosperity has been so great as to counteract the effect of heavy taxation, yet that the same thing cannot be expected to continue long. How long it may continue, or whether it has not already ceased, or is on the point of ceasing, is uncertain, but there is nothing more positive than that, if taxes increase, they must, in process of time, crush industry, and therefore, at all events, they should be kept as low as possible. The whole income of the country is estimated only at £150 million. The taxes to the state amount to £40 million, and those for the maintenance of the poor to £5.5 million. But this is the mere money account, without estimating loss of time, trouble, and inconvenience, so that it may fairly and reasonably be put down at 1/3 of the whole revenue or income of the individuals. Yet the complaints are not so loud, and the clamor is not so great, as when they did not amount to 1/20th of that revenue. This may, however, be accounted for. 1/3 part of revenue is derived from the state itself, so that there are but 2/3 remain independent of it. The habit of bearing burthens and experience of the inutility of complaint are likewise reasons for acquiescence. Besides these, we cannot but all be sensible that complaints were very violent when there was little occasion for them. We cannot deny that the nation has been prospering for 100 years, while the cry of ruin has been resounding perpetually in every corner. It is therefore natural to mistrust our fears, and sit in silence waiting the event. The portion of our expense that consists in interest of money, on which no economy can operate, is so great that it prevents any hope of much diminution from economy. And, indeed, in the time of peace, no economy that could be practiced more than what has commonly been done would diminish our burthens 1/50th part. Even that would be very difficult, perhaps impracticable, for our free revenue in time of peace has not augmented in proportion to the diminution of the value of money, so that in 1792 the expenses of the state were comparatively less than in the reign of Queen Anne. Economy, then, is not the mode in which we must seek relief in time of peace. To carry on war in a less expensive manner in future and take a solid and effectual method of reducing our debts are the means, both of which are treated of in their proper place. The modes of relief, then, are three. 1. Economy in war. 2. A solid and fair method of reducing the present interest. 3. Attention to render the system of taxation as little troublesome and as fair and equal as possible.
Chapter 4.
In no circumstance does the British Empire differ so widely from all nations recorded in history, or from any now in existence, as with regard to the national debt. Not only the invention of contracting debt to carry on war is but of recent origin, but no nation has ever carried it to near the extent that it has arrived at in England. The Italian states, in which this mode was first practiced, never had the means of carrying it very far. In Spain, France, and Holland, national debt met with obstacles that arrested its progress long before it arrived at the pitch to which it has now come in this country. The interest of the debt is above thrice the free revenue of the country in time of peace, as that revenue was, previous to hostilities in 1793. Whenever any operation is begun, the result of which is not known, owing to its being new, but which is in itself of great importance, the anxiety it occasions must be great, and, generally, the alarm is more than proportioned to the danger. If ever this truth was exemplified in anything, it has been with regard to the national debt of England, which has been a continual object of terror since its first creation. Not a public terror, merely amongst the ignorant, but the most profound and enlightened statesmen. Calculators and writers on political economy have served to augment the uneasiness by their predictions of a fatal termination. While the debt has been augmenting with great rapidity, the wealth and resources of the nation have, at least, augmented equally fast, and the matter of fact has given the lie to all the forebodings of those who occasioned the alarm. This very extraordinary circumstance merits an investigation. It unfortunately happens that where people are deeply interested in a subject, they form their opinion before they begin to examine and investigate, and consequently the mind commences with a bias and acts under its influence, the consequence of which is that the conclusion is not so accurate as it otherwise would be. Not that, in calculating with figures, the disposition of the mind can make an unit of difference, the question being once fairly stated, but the previous impression on the mind tends to prevent the fair statement of the question. That an uninterrupted practice of borrowing must end in an inability to pay is a self-evident axiom. It is not a matter that admits of dispute, but to fix the point where the inability will commence is a problem to resolve of a very difficult nature. It is indeed a problem, the resolution of which depends upon some circumstances that cannot be ascertained. There are, it is true, certain fixed principles, but there are some points also that depend on events entirely unconnected with the debt, and in themselves uncertain. Two great considerations that operate powerfully have been omitted by most writers on this subject. The first is the increased energy of human exertion under an increased operation of necessity. The second is the effect that the depreciation of money has on lessening the apparent burthen occasioned by the interest of the debt. That these two causes, which have not been taken into account, have rendered the calculations erroneous, there is not a doubt, and how far they may still continue to operate is, at this time, as uncertain as ever. But they ought not to be considered as of operation beyond a certain unknown point, else the practice of contracting debt would be capable of infinite extension, which is impossible. But the augmentation of the debt itself is not the only circumstance that excites attention, as intimately connected with the fate of this nation. The increasing wealth and prosperity of the nation, under the heavy load of taxes, of which the debt is the principal occasion, is as much a matter of surprise as the ultimate result is an object of anxiety. So long, however, as the nation is not actually borne down by the weight of taxes, its wealth must increase, and what is considered as a very strange phenomenon is only the natural and necessary consequence of increased taxation. When men inhabit and cultivate land of their own, they are under no necessity of creating any greater value than they consume. But when they pay rent and taxes, they are laid under a necessity of producing enough to supply their own wants, and to pay the rent and taxes to which they are subject. The same is the case with regard to manufacturers in every line of business, for though they do not, perhaps, consume any part of what they produce, what comes to the same thing is that they are obliged to produce as much as will exchange or sell for all they want to consume, over and above paying their rent and taxes. Without rent and taxes, there are only three things that excite the exertion of man: necessity, arising from natural wants, a love of pleasure, or a love of accumulation. When a man labors no more than for his mere natural necessities, he is a poor man in the usual acceptation of the word, that is, he has no wealth, and a nation peopled with such men would justly be called a poor nation. When a man labors for nothing more than what he expends on pleasure or to gratify his taste and passions, it is still the same. He consumes what he creates, and there is an end of the matter. And whether he creates much or little, as his consumption is regulated by it, no difference is made to society. But when rent and taxes constitute a part of the price of every commodity, the consumption of every man, whether he pays any taxes directly or not himself, is attended with an increase to the revenues of those who receive the rent and taxes, and obliges him to create more than he consumes. It arises from this that the aggregate wealth of a people increases with rent and taxes, for, where there are neither, the desire of accumulation is the only thing that increases wealth. It is for this reason that, by obliging a man to create more than he himself consumes, taxation increases the wealth of a nation, so that the flourishing state of England is a very natural effect of heavy taxation. The misery and poverty of those people who have little or nothing to pay is equally natural, though it does not astonish one quite so much. As there is nothing in the world without a bound and a limit, it is clear that, in laying it down as a principle, that rent and taxes occasion wealth instead of poverty, it is only to be understood, to a certain extent. That is to say, to the length to which the nature of things will admit of the exertion of man augmenting his industry, but not a step farther. To ascertain this point would be to solve a most curious problem, observing that the solution would, in every case, depend on a great variety of particular circumstances. Something like a general investigation, however, is possible. It will not be accurate, nor is that wanted, but it may lay the foundation for understanding the matter better at a future period. In London, rent and taxes are heavier than in any other part of the kingdom, and in Scotland they are less than in any other. Yet the working people from all parts of the kingdom come to London, and from the poorest places in the greatest numbers. Ireland, Scotland, and Wales are the poor countries, lightly taxed, and from them people come perpetually to pay heavy taxes in London. Yes, but it will be said in answer, these are poor countries. They are, however, richer than England was in the days of Queen Elizabeth. And, if the nature of things could have admitted of people changing centuries, as they change countries, the people of the 17th century, with light taxes, would have emigrated to the 19th century, with all its heavy taxes, just as those Irish and Scotch come to London. This proves that, even in London, the excess of taxes is not yet such as to create a retrograde effect, and it proves it in a very striking manner. Though there may, at first sight, appear something ludicrous in the idea of emigrating from the 17th to the 19th, from the reign of Queen Elizabeth to that of His present Majesty, it is a perfectly fair comparison, and will hold good. Examine it as much as one will. The common expression, and a very significant one it is, that one part of the country is a century behind another, or 20 years or 50 years, is exactly the same idea, expressed in other words. for it is a comparison between the changes which a lapse of time makes in one case and a removal of place in the other. The present times are then better to live in than those of Elizabeth, as London is better than any distant part of the country. That the ability of the nation to sustain a given burthen for a certain number of years is no proof of a permanent ability to support it must be admitted, even if the same annual resources were to continue, but that permanent ability becomes much less certain when we consider that the annual resources are perpetually varying, that therefore they have so many uncertain quantities that it is impossible to resolve the problem. As to the effect, with respect to the increasing the burdens of the people, that has been treated under the general head of taxation. Whether the money goes to pay for a ship of war, a regiment of soldiers, or the interest of loans, makes no difference to him who pays the tax, and indeed makes little to the general system of national economy, as in every case, what is paid to the state is employed on unproductive laborers or idle people. That is to say, it is consumed and never appears again. National debt, then, so far as it increases the taxes of a country, is like any other national expenditure, and in maintaining unproductive and idle people, it is also the same, but it has, in another point of view, a different effect, and that effect is an advantageous one. In every nation, the greatest part of the capital is employed, or, as it is called, sunk. Land, houses, machines, merchandise, etc., are the principal employments of capital. As those are transferred from one to another, or as the use or produce of them is paid for by one to another, money is wanted occasionally. And if there were no other employments, money must either be lying idle in some person's hands till an employment could be found for it, or the possessor of it must begin some enterprise and sink it himself. But when money is thus employed, it is no longer in the power of the proprietor, and though money may be borrowed on such sort of security, it is slowly and with difficulty. The expense, the inconveniency, and time necessary prevent the lenders of money from lending any for occasional purposes on such sort of security. But when a nation borrows, and the stock is divisible and transferable at will, money can always be realized when it is wanted for any purpose that affords a greater advantage than the stock affords. Without this had been one of the effects of national debt, how could the facility of borrowing have increased as it has done? Or how could merchants and individuals raise the sums they now do? It must be allowed that 100 millions, or at least a much smaller sum than our debts amount to now, would have produced this effect, and might answer every purpose of this sort. But there is still a consideration arising from the fluctuations in a stock when it is small, and also from the number of persons possessed of it. People buy in and sell out with total indifference when the quantity is great and the fluctuations small, but the moment the funds are agitated, whether in rising or falling, money becomes scarce for those who want it for other purposes. That the number of persons ready to buy and sell must be proportioned, in some degree, to the quantity of stock, is of itself so evident that it would be useless to enlarge upon it. But it must be granted that the national debt has long ago passed the sum that was necessary to produce this advantage. We find, then, that the evils attending the increase of debt are greatly counteracted by the debt itself, and that, to a certain amount, it is productive of a very considerable advantage to a trading nation. As those who calculated its ill effects and foretold the ruin it would bring upon the state did not take into account those circumstances, the result of their inquiries was necessarily wrong, in point of time, though the effect of which they spoke is perfectly certain to take place, if the debt continues to increase. Their reasoning may be compared to that of an astronomer, who observed the position of a planet, but, in his calculations, made no allowance for the refraction of the atmosphere, who would therefore err as to the place of the star, but not as to its existence. Let us now consider the natural consequence, supposing that future increase is prevented by means of the sinking fund established for that purpose. As to the probability of this, it depends on so many circumstances that are concealed in the womb of time, that it would be madness to give any other than a hypothetical solution of the question. If the war continues and expenses increase nearly as they have hitherto done, Great as is the operation of a sinking fund, it will not have time to counteract the evil. If the war stops soon, it will diminish the debt with a most prodigious rapidity if it continues. The question, whether taxes can be found to pay the interest or not, can only be answered as a matter of opinion, which is, in a case of this sort, equivalent to no answer at all. With respect to the supposed case of the debt augmenting, the observations that apply to that have been made already. They now only remain to be made with respect to the debt being paid off. It has been observed already in the chapter on taxation that the case of taxes being taken off to a great amount would be a new one of sudden and hurtful operation. Wages of labor would be diminished, as well as the burthens on those who live on settled income. It would therefore render people of fixed income more affluent, without giving ease to those who want it. In short, as the augmentation of taxes falls most on people with fixed incomes, so the advantages of this would principally be felt by them. And as the baneful operation carries a sort of counteracting antidote with it, so likewise this beneficial operation would be attended with some drawback and inconveniency. The diminution of taxes, though the ultimate is not, however, the immediate consequence of the operation of the sinking fund, the efficacy of which depends on the taxes being kept up to their full extent for a considerable time. The first effect of the fund is that a large sum, annually expended as revenue drawn from the subject, is reimbursed to the stockholders and becomes capital. This would immediately raise the funds and thereby would counteract the sinking fund itself in a very material degree. Money would become abundant for all the purposes of trade, and it would be difficult to find employment for it. And if the progress continued, part of it would most undoubtedly be sent to other countries, and so be the means of impoverishing this. If then we could suppose 50 years of peace, and that the national debt could be paid off, as it might be in that time, the situation of productive laborers would be worse, of unproductive, better, and finally, capital would leave the country, which would be deprived of that transferable stock, the beneficial effects of which have been mentioned. The necessity that creates industry would be diminished, so that nothing could tend more effectually to bring on the decline of the nation than if all the debt were to be paid off, an operation which, though possible in calculation, never certainly would take place. The evils attending it would be so manifest, so clear, and so palpably felt before that was accomplished. To let the national debt continue to increase is, then, certain ruin at some period unknown, but perhaps not very distant. To pay it off would be equally dangerous. What then are we to do? We must try to raise the resources necessary for war within the year, by which means we may avoid augmenting the debt. That is not, however, to be done while the present heavy interest remains, and that cannot be got rid of, according to any method yet publicly known, without bankruptcy, breaking faith with creditors, or paying off the debt, a resource in itself dangerous, and one that, after all, would bring relief at a very distant day. Since the debt has been contracted, let it be kept up, but let a mode be taken of reducing the interest, without breaking faith with the creditors of the state, so that we may never be obliged to borrow any more. At present, the sum that goes annually for interest, and for the sinking fund, that is for paying off capital, amounts to 24 millions, and the expenses of a year of war do not exceed that sum. 12 millions of this may be found by war taxes, and 12 millions diminution of the interest would just leave a residue sufficient to pay for a constant state of war, and, if peace came, the war taxes would be taken off. The enemies of England would then not be able to make notches in a stick and say, when we come to such a notch, England will be ruined. If this could be done, it would be a solid and permanent system of revenue, arising out of an unsolid and transitory one. Anything like want of faith with the creditors would, however, not only be disgraceful and dishonorable, but would reduce such numbers to beggary and ruin credit so completely that the nation would be lost forever. And certainly, if we are to be ruined, there is no balancing between ruin with honor and ruin with disgrace. There is a mode that would be fair and practicable, and the present is the most favorable moment for executing it. Indeed, it is perhaps the only one when it has been practicable or would be just. By practicability and justice, two words very well understood, we mean, in this instance, that it is a moment when those who would have to pay the difference would be willing to do it, would see their interest in doing it, and would feel that they ought to do it. We mean not to propose any of those imaginary means by which debts will be paid off without burthens laid on. We have no talent for schemes where all is produced from nothing and no faith in their practicability. The late and present wars, which have occasioned one half of the debt, and for which our exertions are to be continued, were undertaken for the preservation of property. For though the French system is so completely bad that even the beggars in England would be losers by adopting it, yet it will be allowed that the evil to people of property would be much greater than to those who have no property. Let us look to Flanders, Holland, and other countries and say no if we can. It was on this idea that an income tax, afterwards termed a property tax, was laid on, by which the rich are made to pay and the poor are exempted. The justice and expediency of this was universally admitted. There might be some difference of opinion as to modes and rates, but there was none as to the general principle. We would, then, propose to raise loans at a low rate of interest to reimburse the present creditors, on the same principle on which the property tax exists, in the following manner. There are, by Mr. Pitt's calculation, and his may be taken in order to prevent cavilling, 2,400,000,000 pounds of capital in the kingdom. Let us then create a 2.5% stock, into which every person possessed of property should be compelled to purchase at par, in proportion to their capital, so as to redeem 50 millions every year, thereby creating 50 millions of new debt at 2.5%, and reimbursing an equal sum bearing an interest of 5%. A loan of 2% per annum on each man's capital would do this, and would never be an object for the safety of the whole, particularly as it would only last for 10 years. As he would have interest at 2.5%, he would in reality only lose half, that is 1%. A year during 12 years, so that a man with £10,000 would only have given £100 a year for 12 years. At the end of 10 years, the interest of the national debt would be reduced to one-half its present amount, which, together with the war taxes, would be sufficient to prevent the necessity of creating more debt. This, however, is not all. A more prompt effect and advantage may be expected. It is more than probable that the moment our enemy found that the nation could, without any great exertion, put its finances on a permanent footing, the present contest would finish. It is now only continued in hopes of ruining our finances, and it is on the accumulation of the debt that the expectation of that is alone founded. We observed in the beginning of this chapter that most people are biased by hope or fear in examining a question of great importance, and that, therefore, they do not state it quite fairly, without being sensible of their error. In the case of the gloomy calculators of this country, fear and anxiety operated in causing a misstatement. But, with regard to our enemies, hope is the cause of their magnifying the effect of our national debt, and it must be allowed that hope had seldom ever a more easy business to perform. The general conclusion is certain, and all the question that remains is with respect to time. The only mode of putting an end to this hope of our enemy and to the war at once will be by showing that enemy that it is quite out of his power to augment our debt, but until a method shall be adopted by us that is practicable and easily understood, that will not be believed by our enemy. The rapidity of the operation of a sinking fund is easily calculated, but not so easily credited, particularly by people not inclined to do so, and who would not themselves have the constancy and self-denial to leave it time to operate. Besides, by this operation we shall not get free of debt till the taxes are raised far above their present amount. Our enemies may be pardoned for believing it impracticable, particularly as many of our friends are of the same opinion. France, which has always been the rival of this country, and hates it now more than ever, envy being now an ingredient of its hatred, knows well that it is fallen and degraded, that it has less wealth and happiness than England. But then it considers that, however bad its finances may be, they are getting no worse, that to continue the war for 20 years will bring no more ruin on the nation, while half the term would probably ruin us. Till we show the fallacy of this calculation, we cannot expect a durable peace. Our ruin is become an object not only of ambition, but of necessity, as it were to France, and nothing but despair of being able to accomplish their object will make them abandon the attempt. We must be permitted here to ask a few questions. Is not the time favorable for the plan here proposed? Would it not be fair in its operation? Would it not bring relief effectually and speedily? Would it not reduce our burthens without breaking faith with the creditors of the state? Would it not reduce the interest without setting too much capital afloat that might leave the country? Could our enemies then calculate on the national debt destroying England? The affairs of nations, it has been observed, become so complicated and the details so multiplied that those who have the management of them are scarcely equal to the business of the day, and they have no leisure to inquire into the best modes of keeping off evil when it is yet distant. Of this we have had ample experience. Allowing all the credit possible to the sinking fund, and a great deal is due, still during war its operation is a sort of paradox. It does not obtain relief. It is liable to be questioned. But we are come to a point where the stability of our finances ought to be put out of doubt and beyond all question. The mode of settling our affairs ought not only to be such as in the end may succeed, but its efficacy and practicability ought to be such as our enemies can understand and give credit to. Without this, we shall have no end to the contest. With respect to what our enemies will give credit to, a good deal depends on their own natural disposition. A fickle and arbitrary people who are continually breaking their faith can have little belief in the constancy of a sinking fund, but they will be perfectly well inclined to believe that men of property may be compelled and will even be glad to pay 1% a year for 10 years to ensure the safety of that property. Supposing, then, that the sinking fund were the better plan of the two in reality, it would not be so in the present circumstances, because it would not obtain credit, and the other will. As to the rest, deprive the French of their hopes of ruining our finances, and they will make peace on reasonable terms whenever we please. Their object for continuing the war will then be at an end, and if they do continue it, we can go on as long as they can, without any addition to our burthens. Whatever the cause of a war may be, the hope of success is the only possible motive for persisting in it. The French have been led into two errors. First, by the comparison of this country to Carthage, and of their own to Rome, an absurd comparison that does not hold, and, in the second place, by looking on our ruin from the increase of our debt as certain. We ought to undeceive them, and then they will have less inclination to persist in war. No pains has hitherto been taken to set them right, nor indeed, with respect to the national debt, can it ever be done by the present method, till they see the effect. For though the progress of a sinking fund in peace is easily understood, in time of war there is much appearance of deception. It looks like sleight of hand more than a real and solid transaction.
This concludes today's reading of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.